We'll see if anyone else is here. Currently, I think it's only me. Oh, I don't know. So, interesting question. Would I still record this even if no one was watching? Yes, I would. It's not the fun topic. It's organisation and distribution. And organisation and distribution is always going to be a difficult one. Plus, it's a Thursday afternoon. So, organisation and distribution of the Royal Navy. Well, as you can see, I'm doing the important thing and getting up sufficient provisions to make food. Yeah. Oh! I've been joined by people. I was expecting this to be empty, honestly, but yay, I've been joined by people. Hello. It's fun. It's working. Hello, Dracula. I was watching your 5-minute videos earlier. Hello, Will. Right then. So, organisation distribution. Basically, how you take all this and deploy it to secure this. It's a fun world. Now, a few months back, maybe even as much as 5 months back, I'm not sure, I gave a presentation. It was this one, the Royal Navy in 1939, and it was given to the lovely quarterdeck talks. Now, I recommend you go look at them, and I may well include bits which weren't in that. Yes, it was November. But I may also include bits which were in that. So there could be some overlap. But I've said if you want to, that video is a good place to go and have a look at. So, what was the Royal Navy doing? And I'm actually using that old talk as a bit of a guide. Well, the Royal Navy in the 1930s has a big problem. It has to secure all this. And a lot of this only marches on paper. In fact, it gets worse when you start to consider that some people were really having, and I'm not sure if this is going to work. Now, this is from 1942, this particular, and I'm going to use a word which could get me into trouble here, fetish. It's the battle carrier of 1942. But if you think they only had started turning up in 1942, then you'd be sadly mistaken. Very, very sadly mistaken. The Royal Navy is constantly having those funds, and the guy who spends most of his time dealing with them, I have a picture in here. The guy who spends most of his time dealing with those fetishes in the 1930s, and having a lot of interesting time dealing with them, is, and just recently I found a second photo, which is just, you know, great fun. This gentleman, Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson. Cute, isn't he? Very cool gentleman. He's the third Sea Lord, and basically he's God as far as naval construction goes for the Royal Navy from about 1933 to 1939. And this is what I will hope someday someone will write about me when I go on, or something similar to this. Henderson was a born leader of men, owing nothing to tradition or rank for his ascendancy over them. It was a matter of personality with him. He was never bound by routine or convention if he saw advantage to service in departure from them. He had an original mind, great ability, and quickness of grasp, but was impatient of any suggestion of formalism or red tape. So that his methods were often unorthodox, but they always justified themselves. That just sounds like a great obituary. Seriously. If you can look it up on the website, and there is a dispute as to whether you can, on the Institution of Naval Architecture website, look up the obituary of Admiral Henderson. Look up the obituary of half the admirals on there. It's seriously, it's being written by the director, basically by the naval constructors who actually knew them. And some of them are these pivy takedowns, which look like they're being nice about them and actually are quite hard takedowns. And some of them, these beautiful outlines of how great and how good they were. And it's a completely different perspective from our traditional one, because our traditional one is based upon historians like Roskell, who considers what kind of battle they fight and, you know, the wars they run. These are the guys who have to deal with them in stuffy meetings in the Admiralty trying to work out the future of ship design. They do not see them at their best. If they still like them, they were very good people. Now, what is interesting is this era is completely bracketed by aircraft carriers. Which is why I find it so funny when people tell me that the Royal Navy was not interested in naval aviation or was not involved, or that it was the Americans who were leading. Actually, in the 1930s, the Royal Navy was way ahead. And in 1934, beginning really of the build-up, in this particular book, the actual first paper of the year to be discussed by the Institution of Naval Architecture is presented by the Director of Naval Construction and is simply entitled Aircraft Carriers. And when you look, and this is what historians like me do, here you go. Here is the actual book. How many volumes of transactions have we got? Thanks to my father, I have pretty much them all. Sadly enough, not all are sitting in my bedroom. Some are sitting in big, sealed, airtight plastic boxes in the garage. But my father, when he died, left them all, and I have got them all, because my dad was a very senior naval architect. And actually, the ship on the back is HMS Montrose, which is one of the ones he built me. He built for the Royal Navy. I say he built for me because when I was 6 years old, I was taken round her and it was my ship. So as far as I'm concerned, HMS Montrose is mine. I know the Queen and the Royal Navy claim her, but she's mine. Anyway, so my dad was Doug Clark, if anyone knows that name. He was a very, very senior naval architect. He only died about a couple of years back, but he was a very, very good naval architect. And it's the reason why I'm the scary naval historian who can read plans and ship designs and go, are you quite sure that's what you say they're saying? Which is my favourite point when I'm dealing with certain very eminent professors in my field. So why is the Royal Navy looking at aircraft carriers? Why is the Royal Navy looking at town class cruisers? Why is the Royal Navy worrying about all this? Well, it's because of this. Now, this is global trade as it matters to the Royal Navy. And the reason this trade matters to the Royal Navy is these are all the big ships which, if they get sunk, are going to have problems. We have professors in our field who claim they're eminent. We have some eminent ones. I have to say the most eminent one, Professor Andrew Lambert, who was my PhD supervisor, I very rarely have arguments with. In fact, I don't think I've ever had one. We do disagree, but it's never got to the point of an argument. He was an excellent PhD supervisor and amazing. So, the reason the Royal Navy's looking at aircraft carriers, the reason the Royal Navy's got different types of town cruisers is because it's got to protect all that. It's got to protect all the trade. If you've never heard of Professor Andrew Lambert of King's College London War Studies Department, then buy a book called Admirals, which I should have on my shelf staring at me, but I think I might have loaned out to someone. Professor Lambert is an absolute amazingly nice guy, but that's not the topic of the conversation, although I can wax lyrical about him quite a bit, because he was an excellent supervisor and the best supervisor I've had. Sea Power States is good, but I actually prefer Admirals, although that would get me into trouble with him and several of his fans. Now, the Royal Navy planned on doing this by dividing up the world into all these commands. Now, just if that's not complicated enough, the home area is divided up into these commands. Yes. Each command theoretically has an admiral in charge and exercising sole authority. But the Royal Navy is not that silly. They look at this and they go, hang on, that's quite complicated. So you have For example, the China Squadron has usually a suspiciously senior admiral, a very suspiciously senior admiral for this station, considering the size of the squadron. And then you realise the war plans usually include the East Indies, the Australia, the New Zealand, and quite a large chunk of the West Indies coming under the control of the China Squadron's commander. Hence, the admiral is that senior. Plus, the fleets are going to be sent out. Now, the fleets, where are they going to come from? Where does the Royal Navy keep its reaction force? Oh, its reaction force sits in the Mediterranean. Nice and central, able to get out and go both ways, depending on what's needed. And you, of course, have the Atlantic Fleet, which is... Am I going right way on the map, or am I going the wrong way around the map? There it is. I don't know. Sorry, I'd lost Britain underneath the conversation. Now... battleships are coming through and aircraft carriers. What's the limitation? The reason they're focusing on carriers isn't just because of battleships being limited, and carriers are limited by treaties. All are limited by treaties. It's covering this amount of water. The reason the Royal Navy wants 70 cruisers is to cover this amount of water. They have battle plans, they have all sorts of things. But remember, their broad stroke aims are to preserve British maritime supremacy, promote the latest technology, and maintain strong diplomatic links and, you know, bind the empire together. Protecting all that, doing all that, means you need to have presence. You need to be able to cover a large volume of water. When the Americans and the Japanese are looking at their aircraft carriers, I often get the sense, although it is, of course, more complicated than this, I'm simplifying a bit, they are thinking in terms of a battle. When the Royal Navy is looking at its aircraft carriers, and I'm going to cover this later on the 22nd of April when I'm looking at the Fleet Air Arm, it's thinking about fighting a war. It's thinking for battles, it's going to be multi-carrier tactics. You're going to have multiple carriers involved because it's going to be a battle. But they're thinking about fighting a war. You're going to have carriers and cruisers and destroyers out scouring the oceans, tracking down surface raiders, doing all the operations they need to do to make sure that as much as... Where have I put that sheet? This is the new fun thing. Can I find the sheets when I put them down? The trade, there is, as much of this keeps on flowing as it positively can. This is critical. If you consider what we're currently experiencing in the world of the coronavirus outbreak, and the way that's shutting down economies, and the way governments are doing their best to keep trade going, it's because trade is vital in an interlinked economy, in a global economy. And here's the shocker. It's been a global economy for a very, very long time. Hence, the Royal Navy in the 1930s are looking at this. Hence, the German Navy are looking at this. Every Navy is looking at this and going, this is the weaknesses, this is their strength. It was the weakness for the Japanese because the Royal Navy knew this, because it was a weakness for the Royal Navy. So when they were concentrating on deterring the Japanese, which was a major part of their strategy. Hello. My name is Town Class. I'm called HMS Birmingham, and I am the Royal Navy's surface raiders. I know we're technically billed as the anti-surface raider systems, as ships which are designed to hunt the world for surface raiders. But let's point this out. We have a large number of aircraft aboard, so we can spot what's going on around us and find out what's going on around, like a surface raider would need. We have firepower, which is far better at destroying merchant ships, really, than warships. It can destroy warships, especially if we get close and we're firing hard enough and fast enough, which we will do. But we also carry torpedoes for that. But really, it allows us to carry a lot more shells, which mean we can destroy a lot more lighter armed ships, which are merchant ships. We have a large endurance, and we have a lot of supplies aboard us. We're a surface raider. It's just we're the Royal Navy. We're not allowed to build surface raiders because that's politically bad and problematic after World War I, when our Great War was against the surface raiders. Ergo, we call them light cruisers. They're known as the Town Class. Despite the fact that, and if you look at the tradition and history of the Royal Navy, it is very much surface raiding. Yay! We made money. Frigates in the Napoleonic War, as the brilliant talk last night on Trafalgar by Kate showed frigates were a good way to make money. They were surface raiders in the Napoleonic era. Welcome to this. Now, well, yes, 250 rounds are the theoretical. I say theoretical. I've done some digging into this. And at certain points, I've found them going to sea with a lot more than 250 rounds per gun. It's been looking like more like odds of 300. They're designed for 250. But remember, the naval constructors are very, very good at their jobs. And they are very good at two things. One, Royal Navy ships that have magically been going around the world with certain rules under the standard displacement, all they're set fitting in with those rules, suddenly managed to find extra fuel tanks somehow. And two, they're stockpiling a lot more ammunition and a lot more supplies. And they do this in the war. So they're designed to 250, but it's a generous 250, and they end up managing to carry more when they need it. And they do a lot of fighting. Remember also that the Royal Navy is looking at fighting a war, so please do consider that. Its first rule is to deter conflict. Its second one is to fight a war. Reaction to 7... he was still in charge at that point. 7 turret didn't happen. 4 turret quadruple was also looked at, but his preference was always the triple or the trebles. He was in charge very much for the town class, and he actually prepared the designs for what would become the Crown Colony class before anything happened to him in May 1939. Does Kangaroo count? Theoretically, George, it would. It does create complications in temperature and hot climates, but most of the magazines are well below the waterline, so they keep quite cool anyway. And also, they were designed with space in mind. If you ever wander around HMS Belfast, it's a good example in quite very good ergonomic design, but also you can see there is lots of space. And the space is functioned in and things can be moved in. Now, what the Royal Navy is trying to do is trying to deter conflict. But also it's noticing things like with ammunition, with firing. Pre-radar, the engagement ranges, and this is one of the points I often gunner, is not that far. In fact, it's usually about 20,000 yards. Sometimes it's less. In fact, they start doing studies and they find that 20,000 yards is about the maximum. It goes down to about 16,000 yards for the majority of engagements. So they're looking at 16 to 20,000 yards. At that point, the 6-inch gun becomes more viable than the 8-inch. The reason is because you can get far more shells because you can fire faster. You can carry more shells, and so you get more high explosive hitting the target. You get more chances of doing a critical hit with a 6-inch versus an 8-inch. Yes, an 8-inch can allow you to hit at longer range, but if you don't have the sensors that allow you to actually focus on your target at that range, and excuse me, I've been drinking too much iron brew too quickly. If you don't have the sensors, you can't make that. Now, why did the Americans persist with the 8-inch whereas the British went to 6-inch? Because the Americans weren't thinking about fighting a war, they were thinking about fighting a battle. That's the quick answer. It's very cruel and it's very crude, but let me explain it. The Americans are looking at their cruisers as substitute battleships. You can't build enough battleships. We build as powerful a cruisers as we can. The Royal Navy are looking at their cruisers and thinking they are our presence, they are our trade protection, and we want numbers versus individual firepower because we see them taking part in lots of fights around the world. The Royal Navy was looking at very much the Battle of the River Plate scenario, where a pack of Royal Navy cruisers would engage a surface raider, hunt it down, and strike a mortal blow. The Americans were thinking, we're going to have a Trafalgar in the Pacific. I don't mean that. There were quite a lot of Americans who weren't thinking that, but sometimes when I'm reading, especially their comments, because it's quite interesting, both British and American constructors go backwards and forwards between the two institutes, the one in the US and the one in the UK, and there are Americans involved in the meetings, and in the proceedings, their conversations involved, you see the Americans are putting forward a slightly different perspective because of how they want to fight a war. And the British are putting forward a different perspective because of how they want to fight a war. The British are trying to deter conflict. They're trying to deploy surface raiders out to Japan to go, look, you don't want to fight a war. We haven't got battleships at it. We're not directly confronting you. We're letting you be the big dog in your area. But we're also making sure you know that if you cause us trouble, we can trap you and take out your trade in seconds and annihilate you. No. Oh no. The 6-inch was never really a dual-purpose gun. It was never. Actually, what's interesting enough is the 8-inch was a dual-purpose gun. Okay? The first batch of counties, they were dual-purpose with their 8-inch because those things could go up to 70 degrees. Just think of that now. Think of the poor pilot flying in, going, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe. And the 8-inch gun is at 70 degrees and you've got 8-inch shells popping into the air next to you. That's going to scare the living daylights out of you. The 6-inch guns had a theoretical capability, but no. Really, when you're looking for general purpose guns, it's... The British don't really have a decent one until the 4.5-inch Mark 6 comes in service after the Second World War, and that thing can go up to 80 degrees and reach heights of 41,000 feet. The 6-inch, the Mark 6 4.5-inch was a beast of weapon, but the 6 were good. They were very good as anti-ship weapons. They were very good anti-destroyer weapons. They were very good for what the Royal Navy needed the cruisers to do. Yes. Actually, no. The reality of war in 1939 meant that slowly the cruisers had been drawn away because there weren't enough cruisers to do what the Royal Navy needed to do, and they really needed the town class to fight the war. And so they were drawn across and drawn across and drawn across. And then when the Royal Navy wanted to send cruisers back to the Far East, the Prime Minister went, we can't afford to send the cruisers. Cruisers are too essential. The cruisers are too useful for fighting the war. The dirty little secret of what happens to the Prince of Wales and the Repulse is that they are actually more expendable in a way than the cruisers and the aircraft carriers. It's easier to spare them than it is to spare a cruiser, enough cruisers or an aircraft carrier. The others are in more use, are in more demand. Battleships are necessary. Please don't go away from this thinking that the Royal Navy was wrong to build battleships, that they didn't need them. They were useful, they were necessary. Matapan, the Battle of North Cape, all these things and many more battleships were useful in World War II. But the point is that at certain points their utility actually drops. And you have to consider that's not an unusual circumstance. The battleship obsession starts prior to the First World War with the building of the Grand Fleet and the Dreadnought Armadas versus the High Seas Fleet and all this thing. Prior to that, battleships and cruisers had always been important. In fact, cruisers had sometimes been bigger than battleships, especially in the Victorian period. And cruisers were critical as the trade protection ships, the global ambassadors, the presence, the status, the things that kept the world in order. And in wartime, they were the things which provided actually demonstrated the control of the sea, which the battleships provided. How did Leanders fit in? They were built first. That is the thing. That I haven't got onto the tribals, but the tribals are basically the point to try and make up cruiser numbers by using destroyers. Leanders are another case of trying to get as many cruisers as you can for the tonnage you're allowed by the treaty. They're not great. They're good ships. They're not great. These ships are very good for what they are. But there's a reason the Royal Navy, when it has to start cutting down, starts focusing on what it does focus on. In fact, the small cruiser is an obsession. At some point, post the Second World War, someone comes up with this idea of cruiser destroyers and all sorts of things they're talking about. And it's just absurd. Because you have this view over smaller cruisers that you can fit everything in you need for the other for the regular cruisers. Leanders were okay for the America's West Indies station, definitely. You know, as Will points out here, Leanders were actually great for those sort of stations. And you need those stations filled. Remember, the Royal Navy has to protect the whole way through World War II, all this, by supplying ships to this. So, in the nicest way, the Royal Navy can put its town class cruisers. What happens to them? They get drawn back to this area, to this area. Prior to World War II, they're based in this area and in here. Then they get drawn slowly back into this area. The Leanders are down here. And there's a couple of Leanders around here, but they're also drawn back, and the counties are drawn back. And all these ships are slowly drawn in by the war happening over here, by the losses that are taken. And remember, the Royal Navy will keep losing ships and will actually be losing more ships than it can replace up until 1942. The Royal Navy only starts to grow again in 1942. Prior to that, it's losing tonnage. It's losing ships. Oh, yes. The 60 round per minute 5-inch guns are very overambitious. And the 1950s cruiser destroyer designs are special. We're going to go with special. They are certainly an idea, but they're not the right idea at the right time. There's someone still trying to think that they can make the world fit their own vision rather than do something to fit the world. And one of the interesting things is the Royal Navy is building up and going, these will take on the Svuldov class. And you're looking at the Svuldov class guns. You're looking at these cruiser destroyer guns. And you're going, you think 2-1 you're going to win this fight? Okay. Luckily, sensibly, various things prevail. But, you know, there are some very, very interesting ideas going on. And let's be honest, the counties were far better design, and various other ships were better designs. The Daring class of 1949 are very much a better design, but they are pretty much the 1944 battle class modified under peacetime conditions to something far better and far more in keeping with tribal. So, the Royal Navy in the 1930s is trying to achieve security. It's trying to protect the global trade. It's trying to keep everything going. It can only do that if it can man all the stations it needs to man. And that's one of the reasons why it's so, the treaties are actually useful for the Royal Navy. Because we think of the treaties as being limitations on the Royal Navy. They are. But they also provide things it has to build up to. They provide things it can go back to its politicians at home and go, you have to fund this because this is our treaty allowance. And the Royal Navy is the only one which is building up as close as it can get to the treaty allowance in numbers and in tonnage and in everything. The other navies aren't. In fact, the US Navy is really not getting anywhere close to its tonnage. So, whilst theoretically the Royal Navy have conceded parity to the Americans, in reality, they don't believe the Americans are going to get the money to build up until there is a massive war, in which case the Royal Navy is hoping that they come in on their side. Either way, if there's a massive war, the Royal Navy will probably drop the building restrictions as well. So, I've already discussed the wonderful Admiral Henderson. I have another picture of him. Look, I've only started getting these recently, so I'm collecting them. There you go. Henderson is not the only person involved. He's not the only thinker going through. You've got Cunningham offering his opinion on the things. You've got Chatfield. You've got Pound. You've got all of the DNCs. And there are a few of them. You've got all these different people offering their opinions on how to build a fleet, on how to match what is needed, what the Royal Navy needs to what its problems are. And they are working on these things. But it is complicated because what do you want to do to make the world more peaceful? How do you make the world more peaceful? How do you balance all the competing and differing views? And how do you as I keep going back to, protect this, which is what the Royal Navy was charged with. Well, you have to fight, and you have to be able to be a wider force. Hello, Mr. Liga. Or Miss Liga. Miss Liga, I think. Anyway, you have to be able to give presence around it. There'll be another lecture on the personalities. Yeah, well, you know, after this, there's going to be another email because there's 2 slots for May left, and I'm going to quite happily do that if that's wanted. There's a tweet going up at 7 o'clock, which if you respond to, if that's what you'd like, I'm quite happy to do it. And of course, I'm doing a special on Sunday, which is to a repeat of a presentation I gave at a conference a few years back in Cambridge to the British Commission for Military History, which is about the Town-class cruisers, because one of the messages I kept getting over and over was, we want more details about Town-class. And I have the presentation on here. I was planning on recording it and then putting it up, but then I thought what I'll do is I'll actually try and go through the presentation live and see if the PowerPoint works and see if this picks it up. So cross fingers and cross toes and everything for me that it works on Sunday at 6. Now, where was I? So you have a networked link of diplomacy. You have all the ships around, but you also need the third plank. And the third plank is the officer corps. And what are the officer corps going to do? Well, they're specialists. The Royal Navy has generalists and specialists. And they build up their own areas. If you consider give me an example, is Henderson. He had deployed to the Far East. He got a significant experience in the Mediterranean. His 2 areas were the Far East and the Mediterranean. He also knew the North Sea and had faced off against the Germans. So he'd had a lot of experience in all 3, so he was particularly good for being a controller. He knew what he was going to face against. Ashworths were the kings of the Far East. The China Squadron always seemed to have an Ashworth in there. At one point in 1939, they have 3 out there serving. In fact, including an uncle with a different surname, 4 of the family are out there serving. Harwood is always going down to South America. He is almost a career South America specialist. And this is something we need to think about now, because if we're going to start forward basing and do it properly, and I'm not just talking about what we're doing in the Gulf, I'm talking about what might happen in Singapore, what might happen at other places around the world. The Royal Navy's got to start thinking about that again. It's got to start thinking about whether it needs to start growing up patterns, careers of officers, people with experience in their areas. So when they turn up as a junior officer and meet all the ministers and all the politicians when they're junior, and then when they turn up 10 years later as a senior officer, all those people are now at the senior level, and it's an old friend returning. This was how the Royal Navy worked. This was diplomacy. And this was how the Royal Navy prepared for war. Remember, when the Germans were preparing to fight in the South Atlantic and all the other oceans around the world, and they were deploying the Graf Spee, they had no support. They had nothing down there. They had to send the Altmark to support them. And what they found interesting was that diplomatically, these nations were theoretically supposed to be closer to Germany. They had these close connections with stronger German communities with Germany. They should have been supportive. They weren't. They weren't because the Royal Navy had been there for years, over and over again, chatting with them, being friends with them, backing up the diplomats, and the diplomats being friends with them. They had built up a lot of knowledge. They had built up, as George points out, language skills. You know, again, I would use the Ashworths as an example. The Ashworths were completely fluent in Japanese, Mandarin, about 6 other different local languages. One of the incidents I talk about on Global Maritime History, and there's a big paper about it, is the Tsingtao in 1939, January 1939, where HMS Birmingham squares off against 3 Japanese cruisers and goes, "You will hand over the SS Vincent de Paul." Well, the officer they deploy, the midshipman who goes on the Vincent de Paul, is an Ashworth, and he's in charge of his men on the Ashworth, on the SS Vincent de Paul, to stop the Japanese getting aboard. He's able to turn around to the customs officers in Japanese and tell them to heck off. and go talk to his captain in a far more polite way than that. Yes, probably if you're going to make forward presence meaningful, you do need to start having officers and staffs out there. You need to have a regional command. You need to have a regional focus point. I think there'll probably be joint commands. I don't think they'll all be naval commands, as they used to be, but I think you will end up with that if you're going to actually do it. Yes. How was the formal channel between the Admiralty and the Foreign Office handled? Very, very well. Basically, in the 1930s, if the Foreign Office got into trouble, if their local ambassadors got into trouble, the only people they could call on were the Navy. The Navy were the ones who would come and pick them up. When there was an ambassador shot in the Spanish Civil War, it's a tribal-class destroyer which races into harbour, picks him up and races him to a French hospital so he's safe. In the Far East, when a mission gets into trouble, it's the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines which respond very quickly. Ambassadors need to be moved around from port to port. It's dealt with. You need to discreetly drop off agents, who were often Foreign Office personnel or other gentlemen. They would be dropped off by boat from Royal Navy cruisers. They would board as a civilian passenger or a friend, and they'd be just dropped off where they need to be. And also, you must remember, the reason why the Admiralty and naval officers provided so much of the intelligence arm of the UK at this point was because they were the ones who could speak foreign languages more often than not. And they also would have the habit, for the similar reasons, would get recruited by the Foreign Office when they retired to become Foreign Office personnel. So sometimes you find ambassadors who in their youth were lieutenants in that area. They weren't going to go on to captains, so they go into the Foreign Office and they become very senior ambassadors in the same region because they already have the knowledge, they already have the skills. Yes. No, it's not just budget. After the Second World War, building cruisers becomes part of the imperial past. So we now build ships which are cruisers in everything but name. Literally, we build ships which are cruisers in everything but name. I was talking about the C-Class the other day, and I said the Type 23s are actually the same size as the C-Class cruisers. Don't get me started on the Type 45s, the Type 26s, the Type 31s. They are all cruiser-sized. That's because we need them to do the roles, the presence missions, all those duties which cruisers used to do. They could have flag officers and all sorts of things. They need, if they're going to fit on all these things, they are cruisers. But we can't call them cruisers because that's imperial policing. Was there a hierarchy of OC stations? Yes. Pretty much the three stations which matter most, as far as the Royal Navy is concerned, are the Home Fleet, up here, Mediterranean and China. China gets command of all this area if there's a major war. Mediterranean has enough problems with all of that area because the Mediterranean is a powder keg of lots of annoying people. The Home Fleet gets command of all this. Now, de facto and reality, there's a South Atlantic officer who's a very senior admiral down here, and then there's a Commodore sitting across on the South America side. So these are sort of distributed command. But in reality, the senior officer in the Atlantic is going to be the Home Fleet commander, and that's going to command for this half of the world. The senior officer in this area is going to be the China Station commander, and they're going to command this side of the world. Mediterranean Fleet can go either way. Mediterranean Fleet is the Battle Fleet commander. Okay? So, what would happen if there was a war in the Pacific, a war against the Japanese, is the China Station would be the theatre commander. The fleet commander, who would come out to command the fighting fleet, would be the Mediterranean commander. So all the stuff from the Atlantic Home Fleet and Atlantic Squadron would rush out as fast as it could behind him, but he would arrive with the force. And then the Atlantic Fleet commander, the Home Fleet commander, would have the job of maintaining Europe and the Mediterranean and keeping a hand on that powder keg while they were dealing with the Pacific. This is the way it works. If you needed them to go the other way, they could go the other way. South America was not the poor relation after 1918. It just wasn't needed to be. The South American navies were just not that strong, and frankly, they were mostly dependent on British naval power to be able to go do what they wanted to, do the trade. So, in a way, I know we have chunks of former empire we can talk about here, but I'm sorry, and I know there are various doctrines of the Americans which are very upset with this. Monroe Doctrine, maybe. But this was very much informal empire. And if you want proof, there is the fact that the Panama Convention, if it was worded any more favourably to Britain, it frankly would have had to been actually written by Britain. It's theoretically America and all these. The Treaty of Panama is to stop the Pan-American neutrality and all these things. Actually, it fits very much with the Royal Navy's needs at the time. Because it was the South Atlantic. They chopped it because literally it was the South Atlantic. And also, any time it would either have to race across the ocean for support or it'd have to race north for support. Either way, it's getting into trouble. So actually, it's easier to have it as part of the South Atlantic because it is in the South Atlantic. So that's why the South American Division becomes part of South Atlantic. Plus, it really does strengthen the numbers on the South Atlantic Division, South Atlantic area, and make it look stronger. Empire navies are a critical part of it. You've got this here. You've got Australia. You've got New Zealand. You've got these two sort of naval division areas of their own. Yes, they form part of the China fleet when it's formed up, but they are their own areas and they pay for themselves, which is great. It's very helpful. But plus, they do work a lot together. You must remember, the Commonwealth navies really do work as one massive group. They are not these sort of separate little navies doing really what they want. They're building a lot of the same ships. They're mostly being built in British yards, actually, especially the big ones. Their officers are trained mostly in British academies. They are very, very British. And it's one navy. And you can't forget that when it's operating. And it's very strategically run as one navy. The politicians may fight and argue and critique and get into all sorts of issues, but the navies tend to work together very well. At one point, you have an interesting scenario where you have the Royal Navy having 3 of its forces commanded by Commonwealth officers, 3 of its key task forces, by officers who are technically from the Commonwealth navies. And those particular Commonwealth navies themselves are actually commanded by British admirals. So you have this sort of scenario that the British forces are being commanded by Commonwealth admirals and the Commonwealth forces are being commanded by British admirals. And they just work. It's being treated as one navy, especially once you get to a certain rank. And it works. Remember, the Royal Navy, when we're talking about this deterrence technique and what they're doing, they've been doing it not just as it approaches 1939. They have been doing it prior to World War I, prior to the Fisher reforms, definitely. And then post-World War I, it keeps the world peaceful for 20 years. India couldn't build cruisers for the RN. Pretty much, yeah. Indian yards were an interesting development in progress, and they took a while to get up to speed. They took a while to get up to technology level. And the Royal Navy are looking at cruisers, and remember, the Royal Navy cruisers have to be very well built. And that's not to say that the Indian builders are not good. They are. They just don't have the technology and the facilities to build up to that level, and the yard space and the yards of sufficient size and complexity. Plus, I'm fairly sure there's a little bit of issues in terms of ordering and worrying about various problems in India in terms of internal politics. Okay, so Singapore, and I have so far managing to avoid this. Singapore is great on paper as your base. If you think about it, Singapore is nicely here, and that's where your fleet all has to go. Your actual fighting base for a war against Japan is Weihai Wei. Please note, that's where the fleet would end up. Weihai Wei. Possibly also in Tsingtao, or Qingdao, as it's now called. But Singapore is the only secure place you can theoretically build the basing facilities. However, you need to put in a lot of protections for it. How important were the sloops for Royal Navy negotiation stations? I'm getting to that. There's going to be a whole special talk on sloops. In fact, I think that is, if I just look it up, because that's easier than me trying to do it from memory. Joy of dyslexia, you know what you're good at. Sloops are the 28th of April. So they are actually the ones after the 21st of April when it's the Fleet Air Arm. 28th, yeah. 28th of April. So they are the last Tuesday in the month. Or it's about sloops. Jellicoe recommended bases on Australia, yes. So here's the problem. Singapore is the best place to build it from a particular trade route perspective. Australia is the best place to build it from a security perspective. And Weihai Wei is the only place to build it if you want to actually be close enough to fight a battle off the coast of Japan. That is your problem. Singapore is your attempt to try and do something. It's the closest you can put a secure base. However, for it to be secure, you need to actually have a plan of securing it. One of the big problems, the Royal Navy isn't so much worried about not putting in batteries which could fire landwards, although they would have certainly liked batteries which could fire landwards. They did want them. They wanted the big guns to be all mounted in turrets and able to go to full 360 or at least 270 and therefore be able to cover some of the land. More, they felt there needed to be an actual military commander in charge of Singapore and coming up with plans of its defence from the beginning. Remember, Singapore falls because they don't secure the water supply. The Japanese have actually run out of ammunition, but the British are thinking that because they've got control of the water supply, they're going to run out of water, so they have to surrender. Then, basically, Singapore falls because the commanders on the scene do not understand the terrain they're fighting in. They haven't had time to prepare. They've literally turned up. They've got ad hoc forces. They've put it all together. It ain't going to work. Would a simpler forward operating base? The Royal Navy always planned to have forward operating bases. Now, Singapore was never going to be the fighting base of the Royal Navy. It was too far away from anywhere for it to be useful. It was a good transit route. It was a good point to build up supplies and stocks and materials and operate as a sort of theatre backup base with the whole of massive dry dock facilities and all those things. But the forward operating base was going to be Weihai Wei, Tsingtao, all these places were where it's going to be put up. Tsingtao was, of course, going to have to be taken back off the Japanese, because the Japanese had been, with British support, taken off the Germans in World War I. So that was going to be an amphibious operation, which is why the Royal Marines and the Indian Army, the British Indian Army, were practicing amphibious operations off Ceylon in the 1930s, and why the British Indian Army was probably, amphibious warfare-wise, the most skilled army in the world. They certainly did the most major exercises and the most practices, and that's where the British develop most of the amphibious warfare doctrine, as goes into World War II, is actually developed with the British Indian Army in Ceylon in the Indian Ocean. Which is why it takes a while to peter into the rest of the army, and why the British Armed Forces are probably have a lot of good doctrine, but don't have a lot of good experience when it starts World War II. Because the force which has been doing this, remember this is part of the Commonwealth Force structure and this is the fighting and the Empire structure, hasn't been the central force, but it's been the force which they've been expecting most likely to do the amphibious warfare. It meant that the Japanese conquest of northern China meant that the British were going to have to secure those bases more, but they had plans for that. They were going to take whole divisions of the British Indian Army, a lot of them, to go and take the points. You need not necessarily, Will, to take Tsingtao. Tsingtao is an isthmus, and the plan was for the fast mine layers, as I see it reading papers, because remember, quite a lot of the archive material doesn't survive, so sometimes this is what I'm making is a best guess based on the other battle plans they have and what they're talking about and how they approach things. But the fast mine layers would go in and lay minefields to basically cut off Tsingtao. And then the troops would approach, and it would, the plan was basically surround it, besiege it, and cut it all off and destroy it. Because Tsingtao, as the British had found when they were supporting the Japanese to take it, was that they were having a lot of trouble in terms of getting water and getting supplies. On the 30th, yes, I will be covering those talks, the amphibious operations of the lovely Indian Army on the 30th. It's amazing some of the things that come out. And it's one of the interesting things when you start reading this history and you look at it and go, wow, that was really happening. And I found out about those amphibious operations because Admiral Richmond, who is a naval historian at the time and frankly a bit of a nutter, lovely guy, but a bit of a nutter, writes a critique of them and says that actually, no, these aren't proper things because, you know, they are landing with armour at the same time. They're not trying to take a port. The infantry aren't massing on the beach. They're pushing inland. These things are not proper amphibious operations. They are entirely false. You read it through and it's just, okay. And then you look at what happens in World War II and you go, hang on, they were pretty good. And then you look at some of the officers involved in them and you go, ooh, those were fairly good senior officers. And then they go on to become fairly good senior officers for the Royal Navy in World War II. So basically what I'm saying is the Royal Navy is thinking about the world. Also, another reason why does it do amphibious operations out in the Far East? Well, if it does them in Europe, where's it going to land them? In the UK. Well, that's going to create issues. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be noisy. It's going to have a lot of press. It's going to have a lot of people watching. And if you make a mistake, they're going to be annoying to see. If you do it in Ceylon, very few people are going to hear about it. Only those people you want to hear about it will. So one of the interesting things about these operations in Ceylon is the Japanese newspapermen in the area managed to find out about it. It's amazing. So they managed to get some pictures. And most of the coverage is in Australian and Japanese newspapers. And a few Indian ones. The British newspapers take very little notice of them. Anyone would think that was a bit of diplomacy going on there. So, all this comes back to, and I'll be covering this more in the Fleet Air Arm talk on the 21st, these aircraft carriers. Why is the Royal Navy building the aircraft carriers it was? And if Engaging Strategy is watching this, I'll say he's right. HMS Ark Royal was a strike carrier. These were battle carriers. Or rather, that is Ark Royal, so that is your strike carrier. The Illustrious class were battle carriers. What's the purpose of them? What's the difference? Well, I thought you might be engaging strategy. So, the battle carriers, the whole Royal Navy is building up this fleet and what they want them for. The strike carrier is for two reasons. One, it's got the big patch if you need to launch a strike in the middle of a war, in the middle of a battle. And remember, the battle carriers will keep the battle fleet, provide the air defence and the ongoing strikes and the ongoing situational awareness and the fighter protection and all these things. And the strike carrier will hang back as far as it can, so it can launch a mass strike when the Admiral wants it to. So you have this sort of combined operations for what they're planning to do. Centerline aircraft lifts are excellent when you want a very stable aircraft platform to, lift your aircraft up. Sorry, winding up engaging strategy. The fleet the Royal Navy's developing is about trade protection. It's about fighting a war, not battles. The reason they're doing that is because they don't know what ships they're going to have available for any particular battle. And this goes back to this. If you have to protect the whole world, when you fight a battle, you're going to have to fight a battle with what you've got available, not what you want. There is no point building a fleet and expecting you're going to have all those facilities and all that there. You can't do it. You have to fight a battle with what you have. You have to deter a conflict with what you have available. So the Royal Navy are building a force based around an idea both of what they'd like to fight a battle with and what they'll have available. And they are planning on building more strike carriers. They are planning on building more battle carriers. But their plan is to keep them up in ratio, build them within treaties, and not scare anyone too much. And most of all, not give the game away. Because they realise very quickly they're building a very different force than their others. You know, one of the things that they notice is when they look at the American and Japanese carriers with their wooden decks and their various systems wandering around, because they do go see them. They do get aboard and get to see them because they go and they're doing all the naval diplomacy stuff and they're getting to see these things. They notice things. They notice their fire protection. They notice the things which are missing, which their lessons have taught them. And they file it away. Because ultimately, the Royal Navy's plan is to fight with what they have available, but to fight when everyone else can't. The Royal Navy is planning on fighting its wars at night. It's planning on Taranto, Matapan, sinking of the Bismarck, all these things. They happen at night. The Royal Navy plans to fight its wars at night. It's going to fight its wars at night because that's when it doesn't matter how big or how weak the local Royal Navy force is. The night is a great equalizer, especially pre-radar. They won't know you're coming and you can take them out. And so this is the Royal Navy's ultimate counterpoint. The Royal Navy's ultimate thing that is building for its deterrence. And guess what? The other navies know that the Royal Navy's planning on fighting night, but actually changing to fight your doctrine and changing operations so you can be as night capable as the Royal Navy is a very different thing. The Royal Navy achieved what it did at Taranto. Imagine if Pearl Harbor had taken place at night rather than during the daytime. Think about the losses the Americans might have suffered. The Japanese couldn't do that. Yes, lots of people miss this trick when it's coming to fighting at night. But the Royal Navy focus on night fighting. Doesn't mean they're always successful at it. It doesn't mean they're always going to be available for it. But that is their big focus, that they are good at fighting at night. If you consider the Royal Navy is the only navy, I think, which goes into a World War II with a doctrine in place for how to fix a target for torpedoes with shell fire. The idea is that a Tribal class destroyer, let's say, or any destroyer, will fire its guns, its 4.7 inches, as fast as it can at the enemy. The shell bursts will be different when they hit the water versus when they hit the ship. When they hit the ship, that's when you fire the torpedoes. Because A, you're in range, yay, and B, you know roughly where the enemy ship is because of the shell blast against it. So this is the Royal Navy's thinking, and it's called fixing by fire. And it works. They use it a few times too deadly. There is a very interesting little battle in World War II, which I will discuss at some point, where the Royal Navy basically sink a couple of Italian cruisers. Literally, they use this technique, and it works very well. They also use this technique against the Bismarck. The Bismarck does not have a nice night before it goes down. It's been torpedoed by a plane, and it's got Tribal class destroyers keep doing what, in the words of its officers, suicide runs, and it can't seem to hit them. It's got some of the best guns in the world. It's got some of the its systems are still sort of working, and it can't hit these annoying gnats which keep charging in at it. It's really blooming annoying. Anyway, so any questions before we finish? Because it is roughly 7 o'clock, and I know I promised that I will not only keep you for an hour for these things. So please do remember, on Sunday it's going to be a special. It's going to be this presentation. It's going to be slides. I'm also going to ask another favour. Could you please share, like, whatever it is you do to grow these things out? Because A, I'd like more people, but B, as someone on Twitter will know, I currently have a bet going with my aunt as to whether or not I can reach 100 people today in terms of subscribers and 1,000 eventually. It's for family bragging rights, and as so is very, very important. So any shares, any likes, anything like that is very, very gratefully received. Family bragging rights are at stake. Now, last question. When the US Enterprise... Yes. It was very new for the Americans. In fact, the Americans and the wonderful armoured carriers is a great example of this, are really shocked when they realise the British haven't been lying about their night capabilities when they meet, of course, HMS Victoria's USS Robin. For the Americans, it's completely absurd that the Royal Navy don't just have individual squadrons or an individual carrier, but every single aircraft carrier in the Royal Navy, every single squadron, every single Fleet Air Arm pilot can fly at night as well as the daytime. They are exactly that. Anyway, glad you enjoyed it, and hope you have a good time. I hope you tune in on Sunday, and hope you tune in for next week's. Thank you very much, and take care. Thank you.